Hi there, my name is Holly Sater, and I'll be showing you this bright and cheery card today. I used die-cut speech bubbles, and I hand-inked each one of them with Distress inks. What I love about this card is all the dimension, and especially the bright colors I used on the speech bubbles. I used this card as an anniversary card, but what I really like about it is you really could use it for any occasion. I die-cut these out of my favorite white cardstock, 110 pounds, so that they'd be nice and sturdy. I used quite a few distress inks on this project, using picked raspberry, spiced marmalade, mustard seed, mowed lawn, peacock feathers, salty ocean, seedless preserves, and pumice stone. I really like to use the minis because it's very inexpensive to buy 4 at once, and you can just build your collection up that way. They also have these tins that you can store them in, which makes them really easy for storage and organization. So here I'm taking my picked raspberry and I'm just blending it from off of the speech bubble, pulling it onto the speech bubble. I like, especially when I'm getting started with the color, to tap it off on my scratch paper. As you get darker and darker with your ink, you can always be a little bit bolder. However, if you're too aggressive up front, then you can have some harsh lines. After I'm finished with the picked raspberry, I'm moving on to the seedless preserves to do the bottom half of the speech bubble. Again, I'm just tapping it off and fading it up towards the pink. I just continue, and you want to go slow and steady rather than trying to put a whole bunch of ink on at once. I'm moving in circles as I pull the ink onto the speech bubble, and again, you want to make sure that you're not trying to add too much ink at once or you will get harsh lines. After I finish with my second color, I always go back to the original color and fade it out a little bit better. So I'm going back to this picked raspberry and adding a little bit more pink. Some people find that ink blending can be a little difficult at first, but what I can say is if you practice, then it will be easier and easier. I really liked using these small die cuts because it was an easy way to experiment without blending out on too much paper at once. On this one, rather than doing a horizontal blend, I decided since it was a long and narrow speech bubble, I would go from left to right. On the left side, I used the salty ocean, and then on the right side, I used the mowed lawn. Again, for this one, once I'm done with that mowed lawn, then I'm going to go back in with the salty ocean and make sure that the fade is really nice and even. For all the rest of the speech bubbles, I did basically the same concepts, but I did different variations of color. This is a really fun thing to do to see how things blend together, just using these small die cuts and working to see which colors you like. I did want to show for this white speech bubble, I didn't want to leave it stark white because I felt like it would look really flat up against all those bright colors. So I just used some pumice stone, which is a light gray, and just darkened up the edges. For the heart, I just used picked raspberry and did a straight up pink and didn't worry about fading at all. Now, distress inks do stay wet for a long time, so you might want to zap them with your heat gun. I'm going to be embossing on these, so I also like to, whenever I emboss, use my embossing powder tool to make sure the embossing powder doesn't stick to where I don't want it. I'll be using this long sentiment stamp that says "Love everything about you." Because it wouldn't fit all on one bubble, I decided to string it across over 2 bubbles. I used my Versamark ink and just strategically placed the stamp so that the words were only showing on the bubbles that I wanted them to be on. That way the sentiment would start on one bubble and end on the second one. Because Versamark ink stays wet for a long time, I was able to do both of these bubbles at once and add the embossing powder at the same time. I like to keep my most often used embossing powders in these sandwich tubs with a spoon so it's easy for me to scoop it over. For detailed images, especially involving text, I like to use the ultrafine Ranger embossing powder. I find that you get much better detail with this, which makes it easier to read. Sometimes, even when I use my powder tool, flecks of embossing powder get on the bubble, especially whenever you're using distress inks, because they stay so wet. In this case, I can just use my craft knife or a paintbrush and knock it off. So next I'll be moving on to the variety of hearts. I went through all of my stamp sets and just picked out various hearts, some open, some closed. I really liked the variety. The way I find that's easiest for me when I'm arranging some small images and going to stamp multiple at once, I like to arrange them right on top of where I'm going to stamp them. If you're worried about your stamps accidentally getting ink onto your die cut, you could put a piece of transparency so you can see through it without worrying about dirty stamps getting anything on the speech bubble. However, my stamps are clean, so I'm not too worried about it. So I'll place them how I want them and pick them up with my acrylic block. Then I can go to my ink pad and bring it right back where I had placed it. This particular one, I'll be using the white embossing powder again. I did try to use a variety of hearts with the open and close, and put some of the closed ones next to the open ones and keep it pretty even. For these smaller pieces, I don't even need to use the spoon. It's easier for me to just scoop it in there and dump it off. For this next one, I'll alternate going straight across this speech bubble with open and closed hearts. I'll use the same technique where I pick up all the stamps and stamp them all at once. For this speech bubble, I decided to go with the pewter embossing powder. Pewter is a little bit darker than silver, which added more contrast against the bright yellow and orange speech bubble. I really love using embossing powders on cards. I find that they make it look extra special and professional. Especially for non-card makers, they just wonder, how did you do that? One thing I really like about this pewter embossing powder is that it's metallic, so it does have a little bit of a sheen to it. I really like to add just a few sparing sparkly details here and there. I feel like that really dresses up the card. Next, I'll be embossing this teal cardstock. I've cut it down to where it'll be a 1/4 inch border all the way around on an A2 card. Because I'm going to be embossing with a background stamp, and it is a geometric pattern with straight lines, I want to make sure that none of the embossing powder sticks. So I want to use my powder tool, and you could see not very much was coming out at once, and for this large area I just screwed the back off. Of course I got way too much then, and I dumped some in my trash can, but that was okay. I was able to put more on this way. Don't worry that you can see that powder residue. That'll wipe right off at the end. So here's my background stamp with the straight lines, like I said, so I want to make sure that it stamps cleanly. The best way I find to stamp with large background stamps is to turn the stamp upside down on your workspace. Then I'll take my ink pad and heavily coat that background stamp with the ink. You can see I'm getting this really inked up. I kind of go back and forth, up and down, because I want to make sure I didn't miss any areas. This is a clear ink, so the only way you can really see if you've inked up the areas is tilting it a little bit in the light to make sure that all the areas are shiny. I want to make sure that I get this inked up really well so that it's clean on the first try. You could use this same stamp and inking technique even for using die inks. It doesn't just have to be for this Versamark or embossing. Once I have my stamp coated, I'll take my cardstock panel and turn it upside down. This makes it easier to line up with the pattern so I can make sure my triangles are straight on the card. Then I'll take a scratch piece of paper and put it right over top. This will keep my hands clean. That way I won't mess up my white card base later. Once I put my scratch paper on, then I can just rub back and forth and push down, making sure that that's evenly stamped. When I peel it up, I just want to be careful that I peel it straight up and that it doesn't touch again on the stamp. Then I'll take my clear embossing powder, and I'm just going to scoop it over some of the areas. Now you'll notice I don't really have a place to hold on, so I'm just holding on with my little thumbnail there. I'll show you a trick for this here in a second. Once I've got as much embossing on there as I can, then I'm just going to take a spot and go ahead and heat set that. I'm letting my heat gun get hot for just a few seconds so it doesn't warp my paper. Then I'll melt that corner, and you want to be really careful here. I've burned myself with embossing powder before, so definitely wait for it to cool. Now I noticed here it wasn't quite melted, so I went back in. I really like clear embossing powder because it just gives a tone-on-tone look. It looks like the same color, only just a few shades darker, and also adds texture. Now once it cools, I can grab on right there and not worry about messing up that geometric pattern. Then I can hold it by this corner for the rest of the time that I'm going to be embossing this panel. Another thing you could do is you could take a piece of tape and put it on the back and use that as a handle, but this worked for me. Now I'll just take my heat gun and I'm going to melt the rest of that embossing powder. I can also touch up any spots that aren't perfect with my craft knife. This is especially important when using these geometric patterns with these straight lines. You just want to make sure that they're perfect because everything will stand out. Sometimes the embossing powder leaves little fuzzies over the edge. You can use your snow block, which is like a nail file, and just kind of buff those off a little bit if you have that issue. I keep kind of moving my heat gun around and kind of doing it in little circular motions just because I don't want to stay on one spot too long. As soon as that embossing powder turns shiny for 1 or 2 seconds, you want to move on to the next spot so that you don't overheat it. You can see as this pattern is becoming more evident on this card panel that my lines and my stamp stamped very, very cleanly. This is definitely due to using that embossing powder tool. Next, I'm going to just use a flat adhesive to adhere this to the card panel. I do want to make sure that it's lined up really well. Once I have my card panel down, then I can start assembly. I suggest when doing a card, especially for the first time, laying everything out so you can just kind of get your spacing right. Okay, so we're in the final home stretch of the card here. I'm using various amounts of layers of the foam tape underneath these speech bubbles. For the one in the bottom left corner, which is the turquoise and purple one, I used only one layer of foam tape. Then the one on top of it, I used one layer on one part of it, and then 2 layers on the part that's hanging off of the bubble so that it'll be even though it's overlapping with the bubble in one area. For the rest of the bubbles, I wanted to kind of lay them out and figure out how they would go together. So I put them down without removing that release paper. That way I could still arrange them without them being stuck down. I knew right where that white one would go, so I was able to take off the release paper right away and place it down. That one only has one layer of foam under it. The orange one has 2 layers of foam under it. The purple and pink speech bubble has only one layer of foam tape, while the blue and green and the orange and yellow has 2 layers of foam tape. This adds different heights, which I think really adds interest to this card. Finally, I'm adding with one last piece of foam tape my tiny little pink heart. For the very small heart, I was able to cut tiny pieces of foam tape to put behind it. That way it will have some dimension and pop up off of the white speech bubble. This card is almost finished. Last, I used my Wink of Stella glitter brush pen, which adds a subtle shimmer. I used it for the pink heart on the white speech bubble and filled in all the open hearts that I embossed earlier. Finally, I add it to my heart speech bubble, the one that's orange and pink. I just love the extra shine that this adds. If you don't have the Wink of Stella brush pen, you could always use glossy accents or something like Stickles to add a different type of shine. I didn't mention earlier, but I used a regular A2 card base using 110-pound Recollections cardstock. I really like this cardstock because it is so hefty that it feels like a nice quality card. At the same time, this paper is relatively inexpensive and you can get it at any Michaels store, which is great at the rate I go through this. So that wraps up this card. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I would encourage you to try this distress ink blending technique with any dies that you have. I think this would look really great with any distinctive shapes such as hearts or animals, whatever dies you have. Thanks for watching.